coming up with ideas that we thought would really impact the people who are using the buildings and shape a vision of what a better world could look like.
It's one thing to have the data itself. I think it's another, as we've realized, on how you communicate that data. How do you visualize it? How do you make sense of it, right? Like data for the sake of data is just a big bundle of numbers.
The role a tech company could have or a specific software tool, you especially highlighted as architects, designers, we're trying to improve the built environment. Welcome to the AEC Tech Series. Today we're going to be meeting Jim and Sonal from Spatio, a software platform that makes it easy to make database design decisions on your next project. Let's meet the people behind the software and learn how to navigate new technologies in the AEC space. Let's get started.
Yeah, essentially, I'm an architect by training. So went to school for architecture, practiced for a while, worked at a handful of different firms. Both kind of for-profit and then also nonprofit. And through that process was, really loved the process of designing and kind of coming up with ideas that we thought would really impact the people who are using the buildings and kind of shape a vision of what a better world could look like through design. And kind of through that process, I worked a lot on hospital buildings, and in particular, was designing, but also going back after the fact to do kind of post-occupancy evaluations. And became frustrated through that process that we just had so much data in hospitals on the health outcome side. And as architects, we had so little to bring to the table on architectural data and how those architectural decisions would lead to impact for our customers. And so, ultimately went back to school to do a degree in computer science because thought that that was kind of a way of it, to create those data sets, to create those ways that people can interact with those data sets, that we would be able to really, as a profession, be able to not only deliver higher quality buildings, but also to communicate better with our customers and kind of really align on how the built environment can affect us. So yeah, during that time at MIT was really lucky to meet Sonal, and maybe that's a good transition to her. I think there's a ton of kind of overlap. We kind of laugh sometimes at how similar interests just found each other at MIT.
Cool. Yeah, and I think I think Spatio is really a tale of two founders, like you said, Jim, coming at it from totally different worlds, but really just kind of feeling the pain point of a universal problem. And I think my background, really stems from launching data products across industries. So have been more of a product generalist, if you will, but have always really focused on, launching, designing, and then ultimately kind of putting out into the world a data feedback loop of some sort. And it's always, whether it's been kind of launching, helping, launch products like Apple Pay, all the way to, in the financial services world, how do we make underwriting decisions, to most recently in health and wellness, it's always been this theme of how do we use data to make better decisions. And so I thought that the kind of power of a data feedback loop was really compelling. Didn't necessarily want to make my mark in financial, services or other corporate settings. Nothing against those industries, just wasn't where my heart lay. And so came to MIT really to take the knowledge that I had in launching data feedback loops and data products, but apply it more to broader health and well-being, and how can we actually leverage the same type of large data sets to really kind of impact the world, at a personal level and a societal level. And so really kind of went down a rabbit hole. I was at MIT about social determinants of health and how we know that they're so important, and equally as important to, my past life was working at MyFitnessPal, which is kind of a health and nutrition app. So we had amazing data sets about nutrition or exercise or aspects that we knew were really important to general well-being. But when we realized, we kind of try to translate that to social determinants of health, we realized that we just had no data on that side. And so I became really passionate about, hey, the built environment is such a recognized social determinant of health. I mean, we spend 90% of our time, basically in these boxes. And unlike, urban data or nutritional data, we just don't have the large data sets that we need to actually, start pushing outcomes forward. And it comes down to the cliche of you can't improve what you can't measure, right? And so it was, to me, as kind of an outsider to the AEC industry, I was a little bit flabbergasted that we just didn't even have the mechanisms to measure to be able to have a conversation about improving and kind of taking the industry forward in general.
Yeah, that's a really good point. I think architects, especially historically, have been notorious about sort of personal bias and personal opinions, especially on these social factors of how people feel in a space. What kind of data is missing out there?
No, I mean, I think the the data that exists in the AEC industry right now is often around square footages, programmatic information, things like that, and it's those are really important factors that go into designing buildings, but they really tell a kind of incomplete picture if you don't capture all of the different kind of qualitative aspects of the built environment that affect our health and well-being. So, in the case of hospitals in particular, it's a great example where there are qualitative aspects of the built environment. So things like visual connectivity, how well can a nurse see into a patient's room, or how much sound is by a patient's room, what views are outside of windows, or how much access to daylight is there. These are all things that through different studies have been linked to patient mortality rates or to staff burnout rates, things like that. And so when we talk about kind of expanding the type of data that we're looking at, it's often about those, bringing into the fold those really important qualitative aspects of the built environment that can be weighed with the more quantitative or more naturally quantitative aspects like program travel distances, things like that.
Interesting. Yeah. And so, along with that, can you track, or do you see in the future sort of a way to correlate these metrics that you're looking at with, like, I'm sure nurses wear like Apple watches or smart watches of some sort, looking at that feedback loop? You mentioned that a lot of data gets lost like after the design is built and you're doing occupancy studies.
Yeah. And I think we look at it kind of two different ways, right? I think the first, to your point, Nate, is if you have that kind of data, right? If you have, actual travel distance data or any kind of key performance indicator that you as an organization are trying to look at to evaluate whether or not your building is working for you. I think one, a lot of what we're focused on Spatio is how do you bring that data into the fold to start to, make connections between the spatial data that we're generating, but also any other data that is going to drive an outcome for you and your organization. So I think that's one way to kind of address it, right? It's like, okay, how do we bring that data into the fold? I think the other way that we're also looking at it is to say, hey, we know the reality that when you're in the design process or, there's a maintenance cycle of the building, you don't always have that data. So how do we get those insights in absence of that, right? If we don't have kind of an army of Apple Watch tracking data, or if we don't have really structured data on the outcome side, how can we still, with just a floor plan, be able to start to have conversations about the way that a layout will affect, the outcomes of that building? And I think the bigger challenge that we're really passionate about is like, yeah, if you don't have that data, you don't have those resources, that doesn't prohibit you from getting those insights with the way the technology has come today.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. How have firms already sort of used spatiometrics to enhance their designs?
So yeah, I think it's been really exciting as we work with firms and have been working with firms since early days to really understand, like, yeah, what is the impact that this kind of data can have. I think one thing that's really exciting to note, it's one thing to have the data itself. I think it's another, as we've realized, on how you communicate that data. How do you visualize it? How do you make sense of it, right? Like, data for the sake of data is just a big bundle of numbers that you still kind of, you glaze over and you're not going to be able to kind of learn or extract insights from easily. So I think a lot of what we've been really focused on is, one, how do we help design teams get the data they need, but then also like translate it into normal speak, or say, hey, like, this is why it matters, right? I think you have to kind of finish the motion there, right? To make sure that it's not just data. And then everyone just kind of looks at each other and be like, great, we have the data. What do we do with it, right? So I think a few ways that we've seen designs firms leveraging the data is, of course, one, just for a stronger iteration loop, right? Having that kind of data feedback loop at your side as you're designing and as a team kind of going through iterations. The second area is actually being able to translate, hey, we have 4 different design options and want to talk about it with a client on Friday morning, let's say. How do we actually provide evidence as to what the trade-offs of option A versus B versus C versus D actually is, right? What are the ways that, if you look at kind of, a floor plan on the left side of the screen and a floor plan on the right side of the screen, you can't really tell the trade-offs that you're making, right? In the aspects of travel distances, natural light. What are we prioritizing in this project? And can we confirm that the kind of priorities that we set for the outcomes of this building are actually coming, through in that fruition? So to be able to visually compare and have that conversation with kind of evidence in hand and an objective source, essentially, to say, hey, like, we're really leaning towards, option B because we heard, Mr. Client, that you really wanted to prioritize X. And so this, option, scores really well, or, has a really high aptitude for that aspect versus, option C, for example. So I think that's the second aspect of, like, not just getting the data early in hand without having to spend hours generating it, but also then being able to visualize it and translate it into a productive meeting conversation. And what we've seen is that it actually takes fewer meetings to get to a decision when you have that in hand, right? And of course, whether you're an architect or a client or anyone in the AEC industry in between, like, no one wants more meetings, right? So I think it's very tactfully, we've seen, that this data actually moves the conversations along forward, and faster. And the last piece I'll say in terms of what we've seen, which has been really exciting, is that people are actually leveraging this data to not only create kind of portfolio benchmarks to be able to answer specific questions to, hey, I'm designing a hospital, like, how do I understand what my average square foot per bed is in practice? Or, hey, I'm designing an office, how do I understand the average kind of journey of an employee across office, floor plates, kind of thing. So to be able to answer very specific questions and make decisions accordingly based on benchmarking, an entire portfolio is really, really powerful. And we've also seen that design teams are actually leveraging that data to submit RFPs. So they're actually saying, hey, we're doing a commercial bid for an education building, a school building. Here's the last 5 projects that we've done, and here's the design standard that we've come to, over time. And as a firm, this is what we stand for. And so I think the last piece of, how are we bringing value to teams is actually being able to visualize and bring to life that design narrative at a firm level, and being able to answer really specific questions kind of by leveraging the portfolio that's already in hand.
So does this change depending on project typology, the types of data that and questions that people are asking?
Yeah, it does, but I think what we found is that we've actually been surprised at how universal a lot of the factors that people want to look at are. So we actually started off working only with healthcare facilities, and then really quickly expanded to others, because just those project teams were saying, hey, this visual analysis, which was really important for understanding how visible nurses are from patient rooms, is actually really relevant in an office setting where we care less about where visual connectivity is really important in terms of kind of fostering collaboration, or certainly things like travel distances, which are really important also in hospitals, are important for proximity to conference rooms or to different amenities within residential units, to within hospitals, or even just for code requirements across all buildings. So we've kind of found that the people have really hacked what we have there in terms of, we have metrics around program, travel distances, visual connectivities, daylight, things like that. And we're always kind of looking for feedback on what are relevant additional metrics to pull in. But I think people are answering a lot of the questions that they have by kind of repurposing and really customizing. We tried to make it very easy to customize the metrics within the app, so that although there is a consistent process, there's still a way for you to say, okay, I don't care about this in this particular room, but it's really important to measure it in this room, and to just be able to click a button and kind of make those differences.
Yeah, that makes sense. I'm curious, like, in terms of some of how to capture some of these more subjective data points, and then also like the ways in which we translate that data to these various reporting systems or sliding scales.
We have taken a very intentional stance on the fact that we don't necessarily want to be deciding, like, what is good versus what is bad, what is healthy versus unhealthy, what is efficient versus inefficient, right? I think the approach that we're taking is that we see them ourselves as kind of this neutral third party that is bringing, objective, quantified aspects of space to the conversation, to the table. And it's really up to the stakeholders, whether that's the designers, clients, everyone in between, occupants at the end of the day, to decide what's important for any given project. So I think, to answer your question, Nate, in one way, I think our role is just to make sure these aspects make it into the conversation in a very quantifiable way, and has the same weight as other trade-offs that we know we are already, trading off, like cost and, other materials, et cetera. And so I think we want to provide a toolkit so that teams can set their own definition for each project and for each client, as opposed for us to take that role. But that's just one way that I think, we're kind of addressing what you're talking about. Jim, go ahead. Sorry.
That makes sense.
Oh no, that's what I was going to say as well. I think the thing that gets us really excited is that architects bring so much to the table in terms of like architects are already innovating on what are the best ways to really transform the spaces that we work in, and I think so often we come up against really hard numbers on cost or square footages. That means that it's hard to advocate. It's just really hard to advocate for something that you can't put a number behind. Not to say that that's the end all be all, but it's a really powerful tool to have in your toolkit to be able to say, okay, yes, we have a number on the square footage, or yes, we have a number on the cost. We also have a number on some of these qualitative aspects that are going to make a really big difference in how people use the space, are going to make a really big difference in how the space is used over the multiple years, not just during construction, the entire life cycle of the building. So I think our hope with that is that we're really giving architects a way to have a bigger voice in the kind of the conversations around the trade-offs that just necessarily happen through value engineering or through other parts of the design process.
Yeah, that's a really good point, especially about like still giving the architect choice. So I'm curious, like how you've navigated these questions of automation versus augmentation. What kind of roles and situations where you would automate or allow for augmentation or customization for your users?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. I love the way that that's framed. I think we are really trying to automate the things that are boring and consistent and just have to get done, and then giving the users agency and kind of framing everything to do around the narrative or everything to do about how that data is parsed. So just to be really concrete about it, all of the analyses that we're doing in our process are automated. So you submit a model, all of the you get the results, 200 different data attributes for every room, just kind of automatically through that process. That doesn't tell you what's a good building or a bad building, or what you should change or what you shouldn't change, or even kind of define what the design space is. We're still kind of leaving that up to the designers. But that it takes off from your plate the kind of time that it takes to do that, and really reduces the barrier to entry to kind of data-driven approaches. With that out of the way, but with having automated that, then it really opens up a kind of rich space for designers to flex their ability to kind of navigate those different trade-offs and the different priorities, to really select and kind of curate the metrics in a way that highlights the design aspects that they are bringing to the table, the things that their clients are going to find to be the most impactful, and really focus the conversations around those.
Are there any things you can share just about sort of your longer term vision of where you hope spatiometrics is going and heading into the future?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think there are a few different things that we see as really helping to make data informed design accessible to everyone in the industry. I think the first is just reducing the barriers to entry, and I think that gets to your question around automation. If how can we make there are people doing incredible things at different firms of creating custom scripts or creating custom workflows that are really great within a single firm. But how can we make those processes available to anyone without having to be a data scientist or without having to have that kind of computational background, so that it really can be kind of integrated with the design teams? And so we're working on integrations with different software like Revit, Rhino to really speed up that process and kind of limit the barriers to entry. I think with that as a goal, then really we see the network effect of the data that we're generating, even within an individual firm, as being something that's really that can be really powerful. So Sonal mentioned earlier a little bit about benchmarking. We see a lot of times firms will upload a lot of plans, not necessarily the ones that they're doing currently, but often just past projects, so that when customers come to them with a question of what's the average size for a classroom in this region, or what's the average travel distance between a patient room and a nurse station in this area, they can go back and have data-driven answers to that. And that's just something that's not possible today because that data doesn't exist in a structured, um, consistent way. So we're really excited about like what the data itself means when it comes to being a large scale thing. Um, and I think the third thing is that we're really thinking about, how does this data become relevant beyond architects? So like basically anyone who spends any time in a building has something to gain by understanding how that building is affecting them. And if we can make that accessible to more people, whether it's realtors, whether it's building managers, whether it's an individual shopping for a home, just having greater literacy around how architecture is affecting design, we think is really what will help to kind of move the needle on having higher quality design, everywhere.
Yeah, especially for moving into kind of how to navigate what I'm kind of seeing as a shifting landscape of work. How do you think architecture students should both prepare, think about how they sort of fit into all of this?
We've gotten excited with the people that we're working with. I think there is for sure a growing interest in, people are really passionate about what architecture can do for building occupants, and that design is not the only way to move the needle there. So I think it's been really exciting to work not only with designers who have not only with designers who are on day to day actually putting together the buildings and drawing them and designing them, coming up with the great ideas, but also with the individuals that want to kind of develop the tools that make it easier and reduce barriers to entry to doing those things. So I think it's been really encouraging to just see over the past however long decade of kind of more and more people starting to pick up, or more and more people starting to say, oh, there are other avenues. Even if I am passionate about design, that it can come in many forms. It could come through design, through software, through policy, through whatever else.
Do you think like the work itself will significantly change, or there will be just more of these like enhanced workflows alongside kind of the current practice? I guess like what level do you think this tech will kind of disrupt what it's like to work as an architect in the future?
Yeah, I mean, I hope that ultimately it means that architects have more agency in the design process. I think that more of the great ideas that people are coming up with make it through to the built environment. So I think if we can automate away a lot of the kind of a lot of the work that it takes to make the case for good design, and really make that accessible and at people's fingertips, that they'll be able to be better equipped. Maybe it's more of the idea of an architect is advocate for high quality design, for design that's impactful for building occupants.
Yeah, I also think that the way things are going, I think people are now excited to learn more, right? People are kind of pulling and saying like, I want to understand how the built environment affects me. I want to understand like design and building. And you've seen kind of through the trends of, healthcare, for example, being decentralized and democratized in some ways, that now people are just really interested in their health. They want to learn more, right? Same with, furniture design and sustainability. And there's all these things that I think consumers are kind of pulling for and saying like, I want to be part of the decision of these things, and I want to just be involved, and I want to be educated on it. And I think architecture just has so much potential for that, right? To share the knowledge, but also to almost create an agency in the occupants of buildings themselves, to say, look, I am taking agency, I'm taking responsibility, and I want to be involved in the process to choose the kind of spaces that I live, work, play in, right? And so I think I can I think I'm getting really excited about the idea that we can normalize the things that architects are championing every day, all the way down to the everyday consumer that's kind of the result or the recipient of those design decisions, right?
That's interesting. Yeah, it almost points towards like this more collaborative effort, like similar to how website design has changed over the last couple of years. Like you can now it's more accessible to be involved in that process if you're not a coder. Like you don't need to know
Exactly.
code to make a website. But you still have web designers. Some of these tools would allow for a client to be more hands-on with the architect and potentially collaborate more. So yeah, that could definitely be interesting. Do you have any thoughts about how decentralized autonomous organizations, NFTs, blockchain would potentially fold into some of these workplace changes or shifts in the architecture profession?
Thought a ton about it. I will say one aspect just to pose to your audience more broadly is I think there's this huge potential for a single source of truth, and I think that's something that just blockchain very like forget all the like other applications of things that we can build on top of blockchain, but just this idea that we can have or we can work towards a single source of truth for a building and all of the sources of data that are informing it in a more holistic way. And I think that's something that we're kind of tangentially working towards, like not in a direct way of like Web3 or anything like that, but I do think that that's something that like can affect architecture in very real ways. But
well, that's really interesting. So when you say single source of truth, would that actually be like a building and its data, digital twin, physical object? Is that kind of what you're
yeah, I
maybe
think
getting
it's
at?
starting to get at that, right? It's starting to get at, hey, we can have a true representation of a building and all of its characteristics. With minimizing the discrepancy between file and reality, right? So I think that's certainly getting there, but we'll see.